Hi, my name is Jerry, I'm a fantasy author and massive language nerd, and in this series of videos, I'm here to give you as much practical advice as I can about world building. As you may have guessed from that intro, today's discussion is about a topic that is near and dear to my heart. Language arguably has a distinctive legacy in fantasy. J.R.R. Tolkien, who codified the genre, was a linguist before he became an author, and his passion for the subject is clearly visible in his writing. Which is honestly understandable. A great deal of world building is about creating and developing cultures, and there is no more direct or pervasive way in which a culture is expressed than through language. You can speak volumes about your world's society and history without naming a single explicit fact, rather simply by relying on how your characters talk to each other. So in this video, I'll be going over some of the tools and techniques you have at your disposal to accomplish that, as well as some of the pitfalls you might want to watch out for. The first, and I think most well-known one of these tools, is terminology. Speculative fiction writers love their neologisms. Some might even argue a little bit too much. Randall Munroe, the man behind XKCD, once formulated his fiction rule of thumb, which basically states that the number of made-up words in a book is inversely proportional to the probability that the book is actually good. And while I kind of see where he's coming from, in my opinion, as with almost any other trope, this isn't about using or even overusing made-up words, but rather about doing so with purpose and consistency. By and large, the words that you use in your novel specifically for world-building purposes can be categorized into four main levels. At the top, we have your honest-to-goodness, genuinely made-up fantasy terms. These are words that not only don't exist in English, but are very often explicitly meant to sound like they're from a different language. Words like Khaleesi, Padawan, Gom-Jabbar, or Hududu. Level 3 is possibly the most populous category, which is compounds and derivatives. These are the words that still don't exist in English as such, but they are very clearly based on words that do, either by taking two English words and putting them together, like pipeweed, lightsaber, or lizard lion, or by taking an English word and applying a suffix like witcher or morphling. At level 2, you have what you might call appropriations. These are actual English words that you use in your novel in a very specific meaning that is unique to your story setting. These can be words like half-blood, slayer, or hand of the king. And then finally, at level 1, you have words that aren't actually neologisms because they are common English words and you do use them in their intended meaning, but they also have a certain association that you want to impart on your world. For example, in my books, the country of Ardan is based on mid-19th century Europe, but it also takes some inspiration from ancient Rome, and so I use terms like province, senate, prefect, or legion to convey that. So when you're picking out the words you want to use in your world building, the main thing you'll want to consider is which of these categories works best for each individual use case. But before we can go into detail on that, there is something of an elephant in the room that we need to address, and that is the translator theory. If you've seen one of my earlier videos, then you might remember how I made the distinction between conversation and dialogue. The difference being that conversation is the actual verbal exchange that takes place in your story setting, and dialogue is your written representation of that exchange. In that video, I brought this up in the context of style and composition, but there are other ways it can be relevant. Take, for example, Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, a novel written by a French author about French people. Because the original text was in the French language, the dialogue in it could be understood as a more or less direct transcript of the conversations that happen in the story. On the other hand, if you're reading an English translation of the novel, then all of the text, including the dialogue, will be in English, but it is still understood that the conversations happen in French. And this creates a subtle but important disconnect. Every culture has concepts that other languages simply do not have a word for, as well as a number of expressions and phrases that can technically be translated into English word for word, but they might end up sounding unnatural at best or just straight up nonsense at worst. And this forces the translator to make a number of difficult decisions. When they encounter a phrase that is very specific to a certain language, what do? Do they translate it literally into English and hope the reader can figure it out from context? Or do they replace it with an idiom that is unique to English and therefore feels more familiar to an English language reader, at the risk of losing cultural authenticity? This dilemma has plagued literature for thousands of years, and then speculative fiction comes and puts an additional twist on it. Because if we're going to assume that your story takes place on an alien world where people speak an alien language, then the English language dialogue in your book can be understood as a translation from a language that doesn't exist. This is the translator theory of speculative fiction. It is one of those subjects where there are a lot of opinions and no good answers, but having this principle in the back of your mind can be very useful as you're making your choices. For starters, let's look at level 4 made-up words. If the understanding is that the rest of the dialogue was translated from the original language, then the implication is that you chose to leave that one specific word untranslated, which begs the question, why? There can be a number of motivations for this. The most straightforward one being is if the word in question is a proper noun that doesn't really mean anything else in the original language already. When it comes to things like people, places, and legendary items, readers will generally expect these to have made-up names, but that doesn't always have to be the case, and you can use this to very purposeful effect. For example, in A Song of Ice and Fire, all the place names in Westeros are meaningful English words and phrases, whereas all the place names in Essos are made up and foreign. And this not only highlights the cultural difference between the two continents, but also serves to make Westeros immediately feel more familiar and Essos more exotic. A similar case to this is when the word in question is already meant to be foreign in the context of the original conversation. For example, in The Fellowship of the Ring, when Frodo solves the riddle of speak, friend, and enter, the dialogue explicitly has Gandalf say mellon because even though we know it means friend, it is meant to be a word that is foreign to all of them. Another fairly self-evident case might be if the word is simply untranslatable because it refers to something that doesn't exist in our reality. These are typically creatures or magical phenomena, but it can also be a concept that is very special to that culture. Similar to how the French have the term l'esprit d'escalier to describe that perfect witty comeback that you come up with as you're walking away from the argument. Alternatively, you might also choose to leave a word untranslated despite there being a fairly obvious English equivalent if the word has some sort of special cultural significance. These are most typically going to be social terms or honorifics, like Khaleesi to refer to a leader or Padawan to refer to a student, but they can really be any term that you think is important. I would only recommend that you use these sparingly, lest your dialogue end up reading like a pretentious anime fansub. Then you have the level 3 compounds and derivatives, which in the context of the translator theory can actually be even more interesting and expressive than made-up words, because the implication here is that you took a word that exists in the original language and either translated it word for word or attempted to replicate some sort of derivation or wordplay. Again, the most obvious use case here is if the term refers to something that doesn't exist in our world, but it is plausible that the original term for it would be something fairly straightforward like lightsaber or mana rock. The arguably more interesting cases are the ones where you invent a new compound word for something that English already has a word for. Going back to A Song of Ice and Fire, there are repeated mentions of a creature known as a lizard lion, and if you read a description of it, it is fairly obvious to be a crocodile or alligator, I never know which one's which. Martin could have used either of those terms and readers would have understood, but he may have felt that those words feel a little bit too closely linked to real-world places, and so instead he tried to come up with a term that the people of Westeros might use to describe this creature. Another, somewhat similar use case is when an author is trying to avoid what's known as the Tiffany problem. If you're unfamiliar, the idea here is that Even though the name Tiffany has existed since the late Middle Ages, it was completely obscure up until the 1980s when it suddenly experienced a boom in popularity. Because of this, if you were to use the name Tiffany in a fantasy or historical setting, from an academic perspective, it wouldn't be inaccurate, but readers would still reject it as anachronistic because of their associations. As I mentioned, the world in my books is largely modeled after Europe in the mid-19th century. By that time, multiple countries had established law enforcement organizations that were commonly and officially known as police forces. So even though I could technically get away with using that term, it still felt a little bit too modern to me, and so instead I went with the more old-fashioned sounding city guard. Alternatively, another reason why you might invent a new compound word for something that already exists is to convey a sense of unfamiliarity or simply a different perspective. This is extremely common in books where the protagonists are animals who are understood to have a more limited vocabulary and just a more limited frame of reference as they interpret the world around them. For example, in the children's novel Vuk, whose main character is a fox, humans are referred to as smooth skins and rifles as lightning sticks. So these are all factors you'll want to consider, but the topic of word choice in the context of the translator theory goes beyond the words that are specific to your world. I remember reading someone's review of a piece of Game of Thrones fanfiction and how they complained about being taken out of the story because Catelyn used the word kids to refer to her children, which is a very interesting point to raise. After all, if we understand that the dialogue was translated into English from Westerosi, then can we assume that Catelyn used an idiomatic equivalent of the word kids in her native language? This is an extremely subjective decision that every writer has to make for themselves. I, for one, distinctively stay away from using terms like okay in my novels, but I have read fantasy books where the characters use it and it didn't particularly bother me, but there is the question of would the novel have been even more immersive had they said all right or something of the sort. Or, to give another personal example, there are multiple scenes in my series where a character expresses enjoyment over someone else's misfortune. It's just that kind of story. Now, there is a word in English that is well known and frequently used for this, but would you use the word schadenfreude in fantasy? I definitely did not. But if you rule out schadenfreude, where do you draw the line? Would you say that a character is acting nonchalant, blasé, or laissez-faire, which are three French words for the exact same thing? When one of my characters wants to say that something is not quite to their taste, would they say it's not my cup of tea? I mean, the concept of tea does exist in my world in the form of herbal and fruit teas, but it's not such a staple drink that would warrant people using it as a common metaphor. Again, I cannot make this clear enough. I am not here to make these decisions for you. I am simply here to point out that somewhere down the line, you will probably have to make a decision like this, and it's important that you realize when you do. So, what do you think? Was any of that useful? Was there something I missed? Was there something I should have talked more about? Well, actually, I know for a fact there is, because this video is gonna have a whole second part where I talk about developing your language's own vernacular, so make sure you check back for that, and until then, stay tuned.